Do you know the best way to feed nitrogen to your crop? That's what we're talking about today on this episode of Blueprint to Yield. Hi, welcome back. Mike Evans here with Calibrated Agronomy. I'm here today with Clint Frese with Calibrated Agronomy, Mr. Kelly Garrett, the famous Western Iowa farmer. The question, do you know the best way to feed nitrogen to your crop? You're the farmer, Kelly. What's your answer?
Well, my farmer answer from a few years ago would be anhydrous. And I know that some of the soil health enthusiasts out there probably don't like that answer, but we've tried different types of anhydrous. We've tried different types of nitrogen into our crop over the years, and anhydrous has always returned the best ROI, the best yield. You know, sometimes those are two different things, but the expensive anhydrous versus the yield, it's been our most secure form of nitrogen. But now, working with Extreme Ag, working with Calibrated Agronomy, things like that, I would tell you that that's not the answer any longer, or really, it's two questions. The best way to get nitrogen into my crop is micronutrients, molybdenum, sulfur, copper, things like that, because we've now learned through the use of the SAP analysis and the testing that we run and things like that, while I can put anhydrous out there and I can make a very green-looking, sexy crop, that doesn't mean that we're assimilating the nitrogen into the crop because we don't have a balanced crop. We want to achieve mineral balance. The definition of that to me is a 95% assimilation of nitrogen that we can measure in the SAP test. So now my answer is the best way to feed nitrogen in my crop is for the use of micronutrients and to balance that crop to get that assimilation.
Yeah. Clint, a couple things that he said there. You're from Illinois, big corn country, right?
Yep.
Yeah. He said this, I think this is key, secure form of nitrogen. And I think that's probably a lot of what drives growers' decisions, wouldn't you think? The security of nitrogen?
Yeah, and I think logistics come into play as well with nitrogen, So, to Kelly's point earlier, there's a lot of negatives around anhydrous ammonia. And I think it goes back to the rule our grandparents taught us, everything in moderation. So we went down, being the biological guy, we went down the whole road of going 28 through the strip till bar versus anhydrous. And what we found was at the rates we were putting it on, 100 to 120 pounds, we couldn't measure soil health-wise any structural changes, any degradation of biology. We wait until it's later in the fall, till it's cold, and we don't seem to have many problems with it. So, I don't know if that answers your question, Mike, but that to me, that's it's all about what is more forgiving. And for me, when we was actually collecting data on 28 versus anhydrous, it was more forgiving.
Yeah, well, I think
it's our base rate.
I think the question I was trying to get to is the security. Like, I think Kelly has you talk to growers a lot just through Stream Ag and everything, and you tell guys to lower their anhydrous or nitrogen rate. What's their first response?
Oh, if you don't explain why, it scares them, and you really will lose your audience. And, the environmental community, sustainable folks, the carbon credit world that I deal in, they're constantly saying the overuse of nitrogen, you got to lower your nitrogen, but they don't ever really offer the education or the reason why. And when they do that, the grower shuts down because he's been conditioned to think, don't let nitrogen be my yield limiting factor. And so it really becomes scary. But then after we talk about SAP testing and things like that, and we keep taking it lower and you show that you're not using the nitrogen, well, if we're not getting that 95%, it's wasted. And then it's wasted dollars. And especially in the economy you are right now, the margins are very tight. I don't want to waste any.
Yeah.
Well, to your point, nitrogen is amongst farmers, a very emotional nutrient. They're very hard to want to pull back, and rightfully so, because I think there's times when we're 20 pounds short in, it can be a major yield ramification. However, when you start to get all the other pieces kind of correct, boy, you can get really efficient on nitrogen. There's much more to it.
Yeah.
We have, Jared, one time he said something that was very profound to me. American agriculture does a great job of producing a very sexy looking vegetative crop. We should be looking at producing a reproductive crop, and that starts with nitrogen. That very sexy looking, deep, almost blue corn, boy, it looks great. But is it producing yield, or is it just nitrogen? Is it just vegetation?
Yeah, and I think it's been quite a journey, at least here at your farm,
100%.
of learning. We really didn't, go down this path until we were able to SAP analysis. And I think, Clint, I mean, explain to somebody listening to this why that SAP analysis has helped us be more precise on our nitrogen applications and what it tells us.
Well, one, when we look at the nitrogen parameters on the SAP, we get total N, and we get nitrate and ammonia. So what we're looking at is on total N, what's in a protein or amino acid form, plus what is unprocessed in the plant, the nitrate and ammonium that's unprocessed. So that is an energy baggage. When Kelly talks about his wanting to have his conversion efficiency at 95%, he wants to keep that plant to where it's constantly keeping that nitrogen assimilated. So he's not robbing energy away from the plant to do other functions, reproductive functions. So for what we've found here is when we want to make nitrogen more efficient specifically, we need the building blocks for assimilation. Do we have a rich carbon soil or not? Do we need to up our carbon game? Are we getting micronutrients to the plant? Do we really need to focus? What's our sulfur doing? So for me, when I look at nitrogen use efficiency, I think the micronutrients and sulfur and the carbon are very much a very hand-in-hand thing of creating that long-term efficiency.
Yeah, I'd agree that, that the SAP that we started with Kelly's farm initially and learning those parameters and having more of a playbook to look at versus just a few numbers on like a tissue sample. We did tons of tissue sample here and really never got the full spectrum of what it is. I think of nitrogen as we've progressed from when I started. Are we feeding, or are we finding better ways to feed the crop? And on your farm, we can go into the fact that, anhydrous has been the best operationally for the hills you farm in and everything. But we're looking at different avenues. And I think, something you talk about very well is just, do we understand what the soil's producing through the year? And does the American farmer understand that? And how does he get educated on that?
Well, how do you manage what you don't measure? And when the margins are tight, I'm the numbers guy. At the end, I told Jared a while ago, I'm all about the numbers. It's really Evans and Wingrove managing my crop, because, the agronomics and things of it. And it's something that we really started about 10 years ago. We started with this variable rate anhydrous. We used to put, you're going to put on 160 or 180 pounds on bean stubble. You're going to put a couple hundred pounds on corn. And then, even before I started working with you, I was putting on 120 pounds in a high yield area, maybe 240 pounds in a low yield area, because we felt that the soil in a high yield area, and this is from stock nitrate testing, the soil was producing nitrogen in those high yield areas, but we still didn't have the metric of how much or what it was. And so you're trying to move in the right direction, but it's still kind of a poke and hope,
Mm-hmm.
And then when SAP testing came along and rapid soil testing, and we start to test that soil, I still remember the first time Jared is looking at us when, we're meeting, and Jared had come the one time in the wintertime, and he's like, well, you don't need any nitrogen at all. Look at what you're producing, and I think that was the year right west of my house. You took the 0 to 6, 6 to 12,
Yep.
You took a 2-foot core. There's 817 pounds of nitrogen. And I still remember thinking, holy smokes, and then we expanded upon that in different fields. We've documented over 600, 700, 800 pounds of nitrogen available several times in a high yield area, 180 pounds in a low yield area. And so now the variable rate rec goes from 80 to 180, 80 to 200, depending upon what we think of the problems are in the soil. And, that rapid soil test really has shown you what is available. And then let's use that. Let's quit spending money on that synthetic nitrogen. Let's use that. And then, the other eye-opening thing was the nitrogen test that you and I did. 0 pounds of nitrogen, 60, 120, 180, 240 pounds. Replicated 3 times. It's our own data, so there's not many things that have more confidence in.
Yep.
You don't have to trust somebody else. We did this ourselves, replicated 3 times, and we did learn Jared is wrong. I've not said that many times in my life that Jared Cook's wrong. But Jared Cook was wrong. We do need some nitrogen, because the 0 nitrogen yielded 140 bushel. But what was an eye-opening experience was the 60 through the 240. It was like 206 to 211.
Yep.
Yielded within 5 bushel of each other. And it wasn't even that the 240 was the 211. I mean, it was all over the board. And so at the end of the day, the 60 pounds of anhydrous was a $36 ROI winner. I remember this trial very well. And I don't even remember all the yields all the time, but I remember the money.
Well, yeah, you
The
do.
206, the 60 pounds was a $36 winner over the 180, which we considered grower standard practice. But it was a $70 ROI winner over the 240. And how many growers are out there listening right now that are putting over 200 pounds of nitrogen on?
Could be a fair amount.
And $70 an acre is a ton of money. $36 an acre is a ton of money.
Well, and then, the compounding late season plant health negative to 240 pounds when we're probably not applying that many of the other nutrients.
Nope.
There is a antagonistic effect to nitrogen, especially with potassium, in some cases calcium. And so it can tax the whole plant. And to your point with the big, sexy vegetative crops, we get these long cell elongation that pathogens can come in and systematically affect the plant much easier. So a lot of times what we see is with growers that are on a major in kick, or, I got growers that are putting on anhydrous plus a huge rate of manure. They're the ones that are struggling at tassel that have disease pre-tassel, just because of that imbalance. So,
Yeah, I mean, great points. And I think it goes to the next thing. This is a pretty generic question, but Clint, you also farm too. You got your farm, but you do this calibrated agronomy. Does the farmer, or has the farmer been educated enough about how the nitrogen actually works in the plant? Do you think? Do they understand, like, if I apply nitrogen, how it gets to the plant and what the plant does?
No.
The nitrogen cycle in the soil and the nitrogen cycle in the plant are very little understood. 3 years ago, when I thought of nitrogen, I thought about stability. We started to think about the sulfur relationship, started working with these vegetable guys. Now we're thinking about the potassium relationship to nitrogen. So, what we think about it today is differently. But one thing that till the last 3 years, have you heard anybody talk about nitrogen assimilation and its efficiency?
No, not until we started with New Age.
And that is, it's the energy draw that's so negative there. The plant's trying to do a lot of different things with its energy. It's a precious resource. So not overdoing our nitrogen and creating that energy demand burden on the plant, it pays its dividends in making fungicide decisions later in the year. There's a whole string of things that changed as I changed my thought and focus with nitrogen and its rates.
When you achieve that assimilation and the health of the plant, the mineral balance, maybe we don't need fungicide. Think about the cost ramifications of all of it.
Yeah. It's a very real thing where we had to go back and relook at how we, what we considered gospel in our management. We do these things. We had to reevaluate it as we've reevaluated more, looking at all nutrients, not just nitrogen.
Yeah, I think, as we talk as amongst ours, the advanced agronomy that we're headed down, it opens a whole new door of education of the nitrogen assimilation in the plant. I think, you talk about nitrogen, next thing was sulfur. Boron was big, 2-3 years ago. We talked a lot about it. But now it's the moly, it's the nickel.
It's all important.
Yeah. And the carbon load. I mean, I think, isn't the carbon piece just as important to nitrogen assimilation as anything?
The three most important nutrients we have are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And everybody wants to talk about NP and K.
Yeah. Well,
so yes, it is important.
Yeah.
It's why we've got products like Backbone, right? Double bonded carbon. It's in a fulvic fraction or water extractable organic carbon, plant available carbon, but we create these double bonds, these high, energy sequence molecules to help assimilate that nitrogen. And it's been eye opening as we've, I'm always, as a farmer, I'm always looking for the cheapest game. So, Backbone can be expensive, but what we found is our cheap humic that we can buy, our cheap fulvic we can buy, sometimes isn't driving the response. It helps, but it isn't driving the response like some of these other products can.
As a farmer, we fall into the trap of always looking for the cheapest source. We need to look for the best source because not all products are created equal.
No.
Yeah, it goes back to nutrient use efficiency and what are you paying for that dollar of nutrient you're putting out. And
if we could back up just a second or a minute, and you said nitrogen is an emotional thing for the farmer, and it is, because if you're a little short, the yield gain or the yield deficit is a
Yes.
problem. But with the sap and the rapid soil, we can measure that so we don't fall into that trap. It's just something that has to be managed. But, like we talk about macros and micronutrients, and I think that there's a stigma out there that just because it's a micro doesn't mean it's as important. It's every bit as important.
Mm-hmm.
And there, I've talked about this with Damien. There's more than macro and micronutrients. There's nitrogen, then there's phosphorus and potassium, then there's sulfur and boron and maybe calcium and zinc, and then there's every other nutrient that nobody ever talks about. There's really 4 classes of nutrients, and that's the way that they're treated. And nitrogen is by far at the top and is very emotional for most people.
Yeah.
And it also comes back to, we've had this conversation on the difference in geography of your ground and my ground.
Yes.
And how nitrogen reacts differently. Where I got a really flat field that maybe we don't have the money, or it's a rented farm, we don't have the money for field tile. I've got to be more nimble and reactive to nitrogen in that field than maybe some of your hill ground.
Split applying nitrogen for you is important because of that.
It is.
That geography. The last thing I need is more nitrogen.
100%. So I think a lot of it comes back to the knowledge we've been able to put together collectively to kind of work through that with farmers.
Yes. And so you need to educate yourself on your own land is the message there. But then, like people, Temple and Matt will give me a hard time. Well, yeah, that's because of your soil. But again, to grow, until you take a rapid soil test, how do you know? How do you manage that when you're not measuring it? Take the test and know what your ground is providing.
Yeah. Exactly. And it goes kind of next point I'm thinking of right now. We're in June, we're filming this. We just got another rain shot. We've had pretty good rain since we planted. We got mineralization going pretty high. Our soil beacons have been showing some of that turning on, and we're getting some things you see on social media, people taking nitrate tests and telling people to go put on more nitrogen because they're getting low on nitrate test. It goes back to testing in season and making adjustments in season like we do here. Do you as growers, from a grower perspective, do you take value in those tests, or how do you look at that? I mean, if I came to you with just an old bones soil nitrate test and said you were short, with today's knowledge you have now, what would you ask? Because I think there's a lot of growers out there that go to the local retailer is helping them out or whatever, and goes out and pulls those samples and says, "Oh, you're low in nitrogen," and they just take it because they've trust them. They don't know they don't have any other information. But I think there's other tools out there is what I'm getting at, right? And how do we measure that to make a smart decision in season if we feel we're short?
To me, it's a rapid soil test. And the nitrate test, like you're talking about, to me, I apologize, but it's like the tissue test. It's junk information. I can't make it's not tight enough or detailed enough information for me to make a decision off anymore.
For us, we've had a lot of farmers in our area worried about nitrogen this year. So we've been pulling a rapid soil in between the corn rows, 0 to 6, 6 to 12. And in some cases, where we've got really mellow soils, we've been going down to 18. And what we ran into is we had a lot of farmers pulling rapid soils 0 to 6. And they're like, very much here. Well, we've had 8 inches of rain collectively over the last, it just went down. We aren't short. So we almost, sometimes we got to just look a little deeper, look a little harder, and we can find those answers. But for me, it's a rhythm and flow. I understand my hill ground is a little different for nitrogen and heavy rainfall situations than my flat untiled. So I think some of it is a little bit of a feel, but definitely the testing has gotten me dialed in to have that feel. So,
as we talk about the best way to feed nitrogen, I think this is kind of an interesting question. As I talk to guys call in or run recommendations, and let's look at that. You're the numbers guy, money guy, economics. Well, if a grower came to us today and said, "I want to go down this path," or I'm interested, how do I budget this? Where do I spend my money? Do I just go spend $50 an acre on micros, or do I cut my nitrogen in half? What's the path down starting to look at feeding your nitrogen better?
Well, for me, I've put very big on soil health, protecting our biology. So I went to, we talk about different qualities of carbon. I went to a cheaper humic at a gallon to 2 gallon rate with my NH3. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm always trying to protect it and buffer my my nitrogen into the environment, especially when I'm putting on my big base rates. Two, in our geography, the side dress is huge. And so the one thing that I see a lot of my local guys are with that emotional rate and pounds to the ground type mentality with nitrogen, they see a great ROI to our custom side dress business or making these custom recs. But then they don't pull back the N and the K in the fall. And then guess what? On a year like this, they don't have the money to come in and do it. So it is very much a pull back a little in the fall. Take a field and split. Do your standard thing. Pull it back. Let's look at things a little differently. That is where I have collectively learned, everything. So it's a very much a trial basis to get that going.
When I have a grower ask me what should they do to get started, I'll be like in its mid-season like this. I will say, take some rapid soils, take some sap tests to start to see what your soil has, because then when this fall comes, before you put in the anhydrous in this area, before you put on the anhydrous, you're going to know what you can get away with. You're going to know how much can I turn it down and things like that. And you need to start to build that baseline of that data.
I think that goes into the next, something we talk about calibrated. And I want your opinion, Kelly, is the data collection, how valuable that is to your farming operation and decisions you make. Because I think as the growers we talk to, they don't know how much should I spend or where should I start as a grower, because really it's a sunk cost, right? I mean, you're just going to pay that expense off to learn. And for one, how much do you value that? And two, how much do you attribute that to the success on your farm?
Now, with the rapid soil and the sap test, it is extremely important. It is the most important thing because of the decisions we're making off of it. When we used to use the old nitrate test like you talked about, or we used to use a tissue test and things like that, and you knew, for example, there's a 40% margin for error, it gave us an example, but you really weren't using it to make a decision because it wasn't tight enough data. And so now when we're trying to turn that nitrogen down, or we're trying to add in those micros, or we're trying to make the plant healthy enough that we don't need fungicide, it's of the utmost importance. And when we, like Jared said one time, the sap test is detailed enough that we can calibrate a product. If the product doesn't move the needle on the sap, we won't use it anymore. I mean, that's the data that we need. So now this data, it's priority number one, because it's what we're making our financial decisions off of. For example, remember when we would talk about the yield map and things like that, yep, and we'd want it to be close. Well, now we're building our seeding rec off of it, and we're building our nitrogen rec for the anhydrous off of it. All of a sudden now, that yield map is really, really important.
The guys you deal with over in Western Illinois, I mean, how do they value that data? What is it a part of their operation now? In making decisions?
Yeah, a big portion of it. We're, when we come in now, in our area, it's 28005. We put on ATS and UAN, it gets side dressed on and you forget about it. And so it's a big good stride. We've split shot our nitrogen. But now we pull the saps in front of our second application of N. And in some cases this year, we aren't really putting on much UAN. We're putting on sulfur, putting on a lot of, in some cases putting on phos, potassium, micros, carbon. But if nitrogen isn't the limiting factor, let's find out what it is and allocate those dollars differently. So that's the big thing I try to drive all my farmers in my area is truly apply what's the limiting factor and dial this nitrogen rate in, because it's a lot of times, at least on our farm, is not the limiting factor.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, a lot of times, even the guys I deal with or get calls and just have conversation ones, is the plant sap analysis and the rapid soil is such a new measuring tool. There ain't a lot, it ain't industry standard, let's call it that, right? But we've seen enough on your farm, what I've seen, that it does correlate to plant performance.
100%.
And I think just on your farms, the fields that we manage via those testing methods are typically the top and do it right. And the fields, there's other factors, planning, all that stuff, right? We talk about, but if we get those things lined and we follow that, those crops are usually the top 10 fields.
Oh yeah. It's not, it's not a magic bullet. We still have to do a good job of everything else to get the crop to a spot where then like for us at the R stages, we can come in with the SAP analysis and hit it out of the park. But if we don't do a good job setting the stage with our planting rate and our planter performance and planning when the soil's appropriate, things like that, it isn't like we're going to save a crappy job.
Yep.
We'll have some fields that we screw up for one reason or another, weather or whatever, and we won't go make those late season applications. But that's another advantage of farming in this. We're not front loading everything. We can kick that expense down the road. Like you talked about, they don't want to cut back on the nitrogen and then they don't have the money later in the season. We're cutting back on the nitrogen, probably cutting back on some seed the way we farm now, and we're putting that expense later in the season. With 6-7% interest, that's a real thing as well.
To me, nitrogen's a very double-edged sword. If you're short, it's a problem. But if you go too much, it's a problem too. Now when we talk about plant charge balance, and there's a lot of companies out there right now talking about plant charge balance, SAP shows you plant charge balance. And when you get something that's crazy, excessive, and dominant, it's going to outcompete something else. So for me, it is all about trying to create more balance between our positively and negatively charged nutrients. And that allows the plant as its first line of defense in defending it against stress, disease, pests. And so that's really, I think, at Calibrated Agronomy what we're after. We're after, a more holistic approach of using mineral nutrition to drive quality, to drive yield. And I think, in our lifetime, that is going to be a big thing, and if we can increase the quality of our ending product.
Yeah, I totally agree. What's one important thing to take away for anybody listening to this when they're talking nitrogen with their crop? What do you think? We've talked a lot about measuring. Obviously, that's number one, I would say, right? We could all agree that we got to measure. But
measure with an accurate source.
Yep, 100%. So measure with an accurate source. So that's step one. Let's just call that step one. Well, what's step two in your books?
Step two for me is having the playbook of what nitrogen does in a dry environment for me, in a really wet environment, and a more normal environment. Because where we have a lot of flat prairie soils, I have to know those three ramifications. Otherwise, they can bite me hard. When I'm trying to be at 120 pounds applied, I may have to make a knee-jerk reaction where the spigot just won't shut off, So right. That's something we don't have to worry about, with farmers we deal with in the hills. So that has been the biggest learning experience for me as a farmer is understand that rhythm and flow, of the environment.
Step two for me, again, we want to set the stage to put the crop in a good spot. But then like we're getting to this time of year, and like you talked about, we kind of want the helicopter to maybe come end of this week or end of next week. We need to start making decisions on, is it worth it to make the expense of the next application? And hopefully the answer is yes every time, because it means we've done a good job and had good weather. But that's step two. Do we think that this field has the ability to be well above average, and we should start to have those expenditures and try to push it over the top? And, this year, like we have some corn that we're not too proud of planted on April 22nd, 23rd. Yep. Not very many fields, but there's a few. And like, are we going to push those fields? That's step two. We have to make that decision on what field we're going to go to next. Because for us, what's different than Clint, we know here in these hills with the lush soil that we have, the nitrogen's coming, and we have to decide if we want to try to use it or not.
Yeah, with the weather we've had here, I mean, it's coming. We've proven it.
The nitrogen's, we know it's coming.
Yeah,
because it's probably here now
because of no-tills and the plant health, soil health that we have. And I think just from this conversation and the history that I have of being in the nitrogen, being in the retail business, the education, I think, to me is always important, and wanting to get educated. Wouldn't you guys agree that I think if you're going down this path, you need to study it a little bit and not just wing it?
Oh, yeah. Why would you wing it when you have these tools? It's so easy. It's so easy to go take the rabbit soil, take the sap, and just start to educate yourself. 100%.
Yeah. Maybe some people aren't as wild as us to go to zero pounds, but how else do you learn? I think you have
to go too far.
You got to swing the needle either way.
Yes. We're never going to learn something unless we go too far and we screwed that up. We know that's too far.
No, they'll do it at every acre.
No, we'll just do that at a couple spots. Now this year. So like now, so you talk about that. We went zero is too far. We had 30,000 population beans. They still yielded with the 150s. There's some other problems that happen, but you got to go too far.
Yeah.
You have to go too far.
Every farm is uniquely different. We learned that here. I mean, each farm is not, as I asked that question, I think Clint, this more you, does biology play a part in it? Because there's a lot of biologicals out there that say, cut your rate by this many pounds and we'll suffice it, right?
Yeah. And that whole question to me is, goes back to the common sense thing. For me and my world, when we get too wet and we're ponding with water, do you think biology's fixing nitrogen in the soil for you?
It's anaerobic.
So to me, that whole, can biology do crazy things? One of the things when we first started with biology, the mistake Luke and I made collectively as farmers and as a company, we pulled back almost all fertility. We went back to a half pound of nitrogen. We did all these impact plots with biology underneath in furrow, 0 to 240 pounds in. And we had years when great growing season, 200 plus bushel corn. No nitrogen applied, rotated fallen beans. The next year, do the same plot, wouldn't quit raining, at 50 bushel corn, at the 0 pounds. So, know your environment, have some common sense to it. You got hills and you're not going to pond, that nitrogen's coming. Evaluate with a test, start there, start to, one of the biggest things that I have done, and the growers that were willing to do, like Kelly said, a very low rate and a very high rate, and do that over several growing seasons so you get different weather patterns involved, you're going to find a happy medium really quick. So
if we pond here, you need a boat.
Huh?
If we pond here, you need a boat.
Yes.
Well, that's good stuff. If you got any more questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to reach out to us. He's Clint Frese. This is Kelly Garrett. I'm Mike Evans. We'll catch you on the next episode of Blueprints of Yield.